Marcus Thompson was not your average man. He had spent nearly 2 decades serving his country with honor and distinction as a member of the U.S. Secret Service. His career had taken him to some of the most high-stakes environments imaginable, from guarding world leaders during international summits to dismantling counterfeiting rings that threatened national security. Marcus had seen it all, or so he thought. But nothing could have prepared him for what would happen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while driving home from work. It started like any other day. Marcus had just finished a long shift protecting a key government official who was visiting the city. Exhausted but satisfied with a job well done, he climbed into his sleek black sedan, a car he had saved up for years to buy. It wasn't flashy or overly extravagant. It was simply something Marcus took pride in owning after years of hard work. Little did he know, this very car would become the center of unwanted attention. As Marcus drove down a quiet suburban road, he noticed flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confused but calm, he pulled over to the side of the road. The officer approaching his window was none other than Daniel Hayes, a veteran patrolman known around the precinct for his no-nonsense attitude. At first glance, Officer Hayes seemed professional enough, asking for Marcus's license and registration. But as Marcus handed over the documents, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the officer's demeanor when he saw the expensive vehicle. And more importantly, the color of Marcus's skin. "Nice ride," Hayes said, though his tone carried an edge that made Marcus uneasy. "Where'd you get the money for something like this?" Marcus frowned slightly at the question but answered politely, explaining that he worked hard for everything he owned. Hayes didn't seem convinced. Instead, he began peppering Marcus with increasingly invasive questions. Where was he coming from? Did he have proof of insurance? Was he sure the car wasn't stolen? The encounter quickly escalated. Despite Marcus's cooperation, Hayes grew more aggressive, accusing him of acting suspiciously and refusing to answer questions directly. Marcus tried to remain calm, knowing that arguing wouldn't help the situation. Still, the tension between them was palpable. Eventually, Hayes issued Marcus a ticket, not for speeding or reckless driving, but for allegedly failing to comply with instructions. Marcus knew the accusation was baseless, but there was little he could do at the moment except take the ticket and hope to resolve the matter later. What Marcus didn't expect was what came next. A few weeks after the incident, he received a summons in the mail. According to the letter, Officer Hayes had filed additional charges against him, claiming Marcus had resisted arrest during their encounter. Furious but determined, Marcus decided to fight the allegations. He believed strongly in justice and knew that allowing such false claims to go unchallenged would only perpetuate a cycle of unfair treatment. Preparing for court wasn't easy. Marcus spent hours reviewing the details of the incident, gathering evidence to support his version of events. He reached out to friends and colleagues, seeking advice on how best to present his case. Some suggested hiring a lawyer, but Marcus wanted to handle the situation himself. As a federal agent, he understood the importance of accountability and transparency. He felt it was crucial to face the accusations head-on, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. On the morning of the trial, Marcus woke up early, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. He dressed carefully in simple yet polished attire, dark slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a tie. Though he could have worn his Secret Service uniform to command respect, Marcus chose not to. He wanted the focus to remain on the facts of the case, not his title or profession. As he drove to the courthouse, his mind raced with thoughts of what might happen. Would the judge see through the lies, or would bias cloud their judgment? When Marcus arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. People milled about, whispering among themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Inside the courtroom, Officer Hayes sat confidently at the prosecution table, chatting casually with colleagues. He seemed completely at ease, laughing and making jokes about the upcoming trial. To Hayes, Marcus was just another defendant, one who probably didn't stand a chance against the system. Hayes glanced over at Marcus occasionally, smirking whenever their eyes met. It was clear he viewed the situation as a formality, certain that his badge and authority would carry the day. In his mind, Marcus was already guilty, and the outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. This arrogance infuriated Marcus, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he sat quietly, observing the room and steeling himself for the battle ahead. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the moment settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. He knew the stakes were high, not just for him personally, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted because of their race or appearance. If he lost this case, it would send a message that such behavior was acceptable, that those in power could act with impunity without facing consequences. But if he won, it might inspire others to speak out against injustice, no matter how daunting the odds. With these thoughts swirling in his mind, Marcus took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for what was right. And as the bailiff called the courtroom to order and the judge entered, Marcus knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, he would face it with courage and integrity. The courtroom was a place where emotions often ran high, and today was no exception. As Marcus sat quietly in his chair, the air around him buzzed with tension. The room itself was modest. Wooden benches lined the walls, faded paint peeled slightly at the corners, and the faint scent of old paper lingered from years of legal proceedings. But what truly set the tone was the energy radiating from those present. On one side of the aisle sat Officer Daniel Hayes, accompanied by fellow officers who had come to support him. They whispered among themselves, occasionally chuckling as if they were attending a casual gathering rather than a serious court hearing. Hayes leaned back in his seat, exuding an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His uniform was freshly pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To him, this wasn't a fight, it was a formality. He glanced over at Marcus periodically, each look carrying a smirk that seemed to say, "You're wasting your time." It was clear that Hayes believed he held all the cards. After all, he was the officer of the law, the one tasked with maintaining order. In his mind, Marcus was just another citizen trying to weasel out of trouble, a man whose expensive car and calm demeanor only confirmed his guilt. But Hayes didn't stop there. Between hushed conversations with his colleagues, he made snide comments loud enough for others to hear. "People like him always cry discrimination," he muttered once, rolling his eyes dramatically. Another time he leaned toward a nearby officer and said, "Watch, he's going to play the victim card, classic move." These remarks weren't subtle. They were calculated jabs meant to undermine Marcus before the trial even began. Hayes wanted everyone in the room to see Marcus as someone unworthy of trust or respect. On the other side of the courtroom, Marcus remained stoic. He sat upright, his hands resting gently on his lap. Unlike Hayes, who fidgeted and joked, Marcus appeared composed, almost serene. Yet beneath his calm exterior lay a storm of frustration and determination. Every word Hayes uttered felt like a weight pressing down on him, but Marcus refused to let it show. He reminded himself why he was here, to expose the truth, not to engage in petty arguments. Still, it was hard not to feel the sting of disrespect when every glance from Hayes carried disdain. As the minutes ticked by, more people filtered into the courtroom. Some were curious bystanders hoping to catch a glimpse of drama, while others were reporters eager to document the case. A few members of Marcus's family had also shown up, sitting quietly in the back row. His sister, Angela, clasped her hands tightly together, her knuckles white with worry. She knew how much this ordeal had affected Marcus, not because he feared losing, but because he hated being judged unfairly. For Angela, watching her brother endure such treatment was heartbreaking. She wished she could step in and defend him, but all she could do was sit and pray for justice. Finally, the judge entered the room, signaling the start of the proceedings. Everyone rose to their feet as Judge Patricia Reynolds took her seat behind the bench. She was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, known for her sharp wit and unwavering commitment to fairness. Her presence immediately commanded respect, silencing the murmurs that had filled the room moments earlier. With a firm voice, she called the court to order and asked both parties to introduce themselves. Officer Hayes went first, standing tall, as he recited his name and badge number. His tone was authoritative, dripping with self-assurance. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He introduced himself simply as Marcus Thompson, without mentioning his profession. This decision was intentional. Marcus wanted the focus to remain on the facts of the case, not on his status as a federal agent. Still, something about the way he carried himself caught the attention of those in the room. There was a quiet strength in his posture, a sense of dignity that couldn't be ignored. Once introductions were complete, the prosecutor began laying out the case against Marcus. Using dramatic gestures and carefully chosen words, he painted a picture of Marcus as a defiant individual who had challenged Officer Hayes' authority. According to the prosecution, Marcus had been argumentative and uncooperative during the traffic stop, refusing to follow simple instructions. The prosecutor emphasized these points repeatedly, attempting to sway the jury's opinion before Marcus even had a chance to speak. Throughout this opening statement, Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable. He noted every exaggeration, every distortion of the truth. While the prosecutor spoke, Hayes nodded along smugly, clearly pleased with how things were unfolding. He exchanged knowing looks with his colleagues, convinced that victory was within reach. To them, Marcus was already guilty and nothing he said would change that. When it came time for Marcus to respond, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Though he hadn't spoken yet, the anticipation was palpable. Everyone wondered what kind of defense Marcus would offer. Would he crumble under pressure? Or would he rise to the occasion and prove his innocence? Even Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her pen poised to take notes. Marcus cleared his throat softly before beginning. His voice was steady, neither too loud nor too soft, carrying just enough weight to command attention. He started by recounting the events of the traffic stop, sticking closely to the facts. He described how he had pulled over promptly after seeing the flashing lights, how he had handed over his documents without hesitation, and how Hayes' attitude had changed upon noticing the make and model of his car. Each detail was delivered with precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. As Marcus continued, the mood in the courtroom began to shift. People who had initially dismissed him as just another defendant started paying closer attention. There was a sincerity in his words, a clarity that resonated with those listening. Even some of Hayes' colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the tide might be turning. For the first time since the trial began, Hayes stopped smirking. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence wavering, ever so slightly. Despite the mounting tension, Marcus remained unfazed. He knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and he needed to choose his next move wisely. But as he concluded his initial remarks and returned to his seat, one thing became abundantly clear. Marcus Thompson was not backing down. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it head-on, with courage, integrity, and an unshakable belief in the power of truth. The courtroom was now fully immersed in the heart of the trial, and the tension was almost tangible. After Marcus had laid out his version of events with calm precision, it was Officer Hayes' turn to take the stand. The prosecutor, eager to reinforce their narrative, guided Hayes through a series of questions designed to paint Marcus as defiant and uncooperative. Hayes, still clinging to his earlier confidence, didn't hesitate to embellish his account. "Officer Hayes," the prosecutor began, his tone smooth and deliberate, "can you describe what happened during your encounter with Mr. Thompson on the day in question?" Hayes straightened up in the witness chair, adopting an air of authority. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice firm. "I pulled Mr. Thompson over for a routine traffic stop. At first, everything seemed normal. He handed over his license and registration without issue. But then things took a turn." "What do you mean by things took a turn?" the prosecutor asked, feigning curiosity. Hayes leaned forward, slightly as if sharing a secret. "Well, sir, I noticed that Mr. Thompson became increasingly agitated. He started questioning my authority, raising his voice and refusing to comply with basic instructions. It was clear he was trying to intimidate me." Marcus listened intently from his seat, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, He knew this wasn't true, far from it. But he also understood that arguing at this moment would only make him appear defensive. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, letting the falsehoods hang in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The prosecutor pressed on. "And how did you respond to Mr. Thompson's behavior?" "I remained professional throughout," Hayes said, his tone dripping with self-righteousness. "But when he continued to resist, I had no choice but to issue a citation for non-compliance. His actions left me no other option." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some attendees nodded along, clearly swayed by Hayes's confident delivery. Others exchanged skeptical glances, unsure of whom to believe. Judge Reynolds sat silently, her expression neutral, but her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When it came time for cross-examination, Marcus rose from his seat. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. For a brief moment, even Hayes seemed taken aback by the quiet intensity in Marcus's demeanor. This wasn't the same man who had walked into the courtroom hours ago. This was someone prepared to dismantle the lies piece by piece. "Officer Hayes," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "you mentioned that I raised my voice during our encounter. Can you recall exactly what I said that made you feel intimidated?" Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "You questioned why I pulled you over and accused me of targeting you unfairly." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering the response. "Interesting. So asking why I was pulled over is now considered raising my voice or intimidation? Isn't that a citizen's right, to ask an officer for clarification?" The courtroom stirred again, this time with murmurs of agreement. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not about the question itself," he countered. "It's about the tone and attitude behind it." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I see. And yet, you admitted earlier that I complied with your request for my license and registration. If I was being so confrontational, wouldn't I have refused outright?" Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, realizing he'd been backed into a corner. Instead, he offered a vague reply. "You were difficult to deal with, plain and simple." Marcus pressed further. "Difficult how?" "Did I refuse to answer your questions? Did I physically obstruct you in any way?" "No," Hayes admitted reluctantly. But nothing," Marcus interrupted gently, his tone polite yet firm. "If I followed every instruction you gave me, then where exactly did I go wrong? Or is it possible that your perception of me changed the moment you saw the car I drive and the color of my skin?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the room entirely. Hayes's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. For the first time since the trial began, his earlier bravado faltered. He glanced toward the prosecutor for support, but even the lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes fixed on Hayes. "Answer the question, officer," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Hayes swallowed hard before responding. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Thompson. I treat everyone equally under the law." Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "That's good to hear, officer. But let's be honest. Your testimony today suggests otherwise. You claim I was argumentative, yet there's no evidence to support that. You accuse me of resisting arrest, yet even you admit I complied with your orders. What we're left with, then, is a discrepancy between your version of events and mine." As Marcus spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. The initial skepticism directed at Marcus began to wane, replaced by growing doubt about Hayes's credibility. Even some of Hayes's colleagues exchanged uneasy looks, sensing that the tide was turning against them. Determined to regain control of the narrative, the prosecutor stepped in. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting that Officer Hayes fabricated these allegations out of bias?" Marcus paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I'm saying is that perceptions matter. When someone assumes guilt based on appearances rather than facts, it creates a dangerous precedent." My hope is that this court will see through those assumptions and focus solely on the truth." The prosecutor frowned, clearly frustrated by Marcus's poise and logic. "Very well," he muttered, retreating to his seat. With the cross-examination complete, Marcus returned to his chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction despite the gravity of the situation. He had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those present, forcing them to question the validity of Hayes's claims. But he wasn't done yet. Not quite. Before concluding his statement, Marcus decided to address one final point. Rising once more, he turned to face Judge Reynolds directly. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "I understand the importance of respecting law enforcement officers and the role they play in keeping our communities safe. However, respect must be earned through fairness and integrity. Today I stand here not as a victim, but as someone seeking accountability. If we allow baseless accusations to go unchecked, we risk eroding trust in the very system meant to protect us." His words resonated deeply with many in the room, including Judge Reynolds, whose expression softened ever so slightly. She nodded thoughtfully, signaling that she had heard him loud and clear. As Marcus sat back down, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. People whispered among themselves, debating the merits of each side's arguments. Hayes, meanwhile, slumped slightly in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable unease. He glanced nervously at the prosecutor, who avoided eye contact altogether. For Marcus, this was more than just a legal battle. It was a test of character, resilience, and faith in the justice system. Though the outcome remained uncertain, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every word he had spoken was a step toward exposing the truth, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever faced similar injustices. Little did anyone know, however, that the most dramatic moment of the trial was still to come. As the proceedings drew closer to their conclusion, Marcus reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. He knew exactly when to reveal it, and when he did, the entire courtroom would freeze in stunned silence. The courtroom was tense, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with anticipation. Everyone could sense that the trial was reaching its climax. The prosecutor had finished grilling Marcus about his side of the story, trying to poke holes in his calm and logical defense, but Marcus remained unshaken, his composure unwavering. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't going to let baseless accusations define him. As Marcus prepared to deliver his closing remarks, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the moment where he would lay everything on the line. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, commanding attention without saying a word. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Even Officer Hayes, who had been whispering confidently with his colleagues just moments ago, stopped talking and looked at Marcus with wary curiosity. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady, "I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present my case today. I also want to acknowledge the importance of law enforcement officers like Officer Hayes, who work tirelessly to keep our communities safe. However, what we're discussing here isn't about whether or not I respect authority. It's about ensuring that authority is exercised fairly and responsibly." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Judge Reynolds nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful but neutral. Marcus continued, his tone measured yet firm. "Throughout this trial, Officer Hayes has accused me of being argumentative, uncooperative, and even resistant during our encounter. Yet when asked to provide specific examples of my behavior, he struggled to do so. Instead, we've heard vague claims about tone and attitude which are subjective at best." Marcus glanced briefly at Hayes, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What concerns me most," Marcus went on, "isn't just the lack of evidence supporting these allegations, it's the underlying assumptions that seem to have driven them. From the moment Officer Hayes approached my vehicle, his perception of me appeared to change based not on my actions, but on superficial factors. The car I drive and the color of my skin." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some attendees nodded in agreement while others exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. Marcus pressed on, his voice growing more impassioned but never losing its calmness. This isn't just about me. It's about countless individuals who face similar treatment every day, people whose lives are disrupted because someone in power made assumptions instead of seeking facts. For a brief moment, Marcus locked eyes with Hayes. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet determination to expose the truth. "I believe Officer Hayes thought he was doing his job," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "But when assumptions replace facts, it undermines trust, not just between citizens and law enforcement, but within the entire justice system. And that's something none of us can afford to ignore." As he spoke, Marcus reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. At first, no one noticed the subtle movement, but when he pulled out a small gold-plated badge and held it up for everyone to see, the room erupted into gasps. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its weight and significance undeniable. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. "Officer." Hayes froze too, his face draining of color. His mouth hung open slightly as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The prosecutor, who had been scribbling notes furiously, stopped mid-sentence, his pen hovering above the page. Even Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the unexpected twist. "This," Marcus said, holding the badge aloft, "is my credential as a U.S. Secret Service agent. I chose not to mention it earlier because I wanted this case to be judged solely on its merits, not on my profession. But given the false narrative presented against me and the implications of bias, I feel it's necessary to clarify who I am." The courtroom buzzed with shock and disbelief. Whispers filled the air as people tried to process what they were witnessing. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, while members of Marcus's family exchanged proud smiles. Angela, his sister, wiped away a tear, overwhelmed by the sight of her brother standing tall despite the odds stacked against him. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat, bringing the room back to order. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her tone sharp but curious, "can you explain why you didn't disclose your status as a federal agent sooner?" Marcus nodded respectfully. "Your Honor, I wanted to ensure that this case was decided based on the facts, not on titles or affiliations. Unfortunately, the accusations against me appear to stem from preconceived notions rather than actual evidence. By revealing my badge now, I hope to highlight the disparity between perception and reality." Hayes, still pale and visibly shaken, stammered an attempt at a response. I didn't know," he muttered weakly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "If I had known." "If you had known," Marcus interrupted gently, "would it have changed how you treated me, or would you still have assumed the worst based on appearances alone?" Hayes opened his mouth to reply but found no words. He slumped back in his chair, defeated, as the weight of his actions settled heavily upon him. The prosecutor, realizing the tide had turned irreversibly against them, exchanged a panicked glance with Hayes before hastily gathering his papers. Judge Reynolds wasted no time addressing the situation. "Given the new information presented," she announced, her voice carrying authority, "and considering the lack of credible evidence supporting the charges against Mr. Thompson, I see no reason to proceed further. These charges are hereby dismissed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs of approval. People clapped softly, careful not to disrupt the solemnity of the setting. Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and vindication wash over him. He hadn't sought applause or recognition, he simply wanted justice, and in that moment he felt he had achieved it. As the judge called the session to a close, Marcus turned to leave. Before stepping out of the courtroom, he paused to address Hayes one final time. "Officer Hayes," he said quietly, his tone devoid of malice, "I hope this experience serves as a reminder that assumptions can harm both sides. We all have a responsibility to act with fairness and integrity. Let's learn from this and move forward." With that, Marcus walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. Outside, reporters eagerly awaited him, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. But Marcus didn't linger. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving behind the chaos of the courthouse. Though the battle was won, Marcus knew the war against prejudice and bias was far from over. Still, as he navigated the streets of the city, he allowed himself a small smile. Today, he had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had sent a powerful message to anyone willing to listen. The dismissal of charges against Marcus Thompson sent shockwaves far beyond the confines of the courtroom. News of the trial spread rapidly, fueled by reporters who had been waiting outside the courthouse to capture every detail. Within hours, headlines blared across local and national media outlets. Secret Service agent wrongfully accused in shocking courtroom twist, and officer faces backlash after mocking federal agent. The story ignited conversations everywhere, from social media platforms to dinner tables, as people debated the implications of what had happened. For Officer Daniel Hayes, the aftermath was nothing short of devastating. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a public relations nightmare. His name was dragged through the mud, with critics accusing him of racial profiling and abuse of power. Fellow officers distanced themselves from him, fearing association with someone now seen as a symbol of systemic bias. Even his superiors were forced to take action. The police department launched an internal investigation into Hayes' conduct, suspending him without pay pending the results. Hayes tried to defend himself during interviews, insisting that he hadn't acted out of malice. "I didn't know he was a federal agent," he repeated over and over again, as if that single fact could absolve him of responsibility. But the public wasn't buying it. Many pointed out that even if Marcus hadn't been a Secret Service agent, Hayes' behavior during the traffic stop, and later in court, still raised serious questions about fairness and accountability. It wasn't just about the badge. It was about how quickly assumptions had clouded judgment. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight, something he neither sought nor enjoyed. Reporters hounded him for comments, eager to turn his story into a rallying cry against racial injustice. While Marcus appreciated the support, he remained cautious, wary of being reduced to a talking point or a hashtag. Instead, he focused on using his platform to spark meaningful change. He gave one carefully crafted interview to a reputable news outlet, emphasizing the need for reform rather than retribution. "I don't want this to be about punishing one person," Marcus said during the interview. "This is about addressing larger issues within our society. Issues like implicit bias, unequal treatment under the law, and the erosion of trust between communities and law enforcement. We can't move forward unless we confront these problems head-on." His words resonated deeply, earning praise from activists, community leaders, and even some members of law enforcement who agreed that systemic changes were long overdue. Inspired by the response, Marcus began collaborating with advocacy groups dedicated to promoting transparency and accountability in policing. He shared his experiences at town hall meetings, speaking candidly about the challenges faced by marginalized communities when interacting with law enforcement. His message was always the same: progress required empathy, education, and a willingness to listen. Of course, not everyone applauded Marcus's efforts. Some accused him of grandstanding, claiming he was exploiting the incident for personal gain. Others dismissed his story altogether, arguing that it was an isolated case blown out of proportion by the media. These criticisms stung, but Marcus refused to let them derail him. He understood that change often came slowly and met resistance along the way. What mattered most was staying true to his values and continuing to push for justice, even when the odds felt insurmountable. As weeks turned into months, the fallout from the trial continued to unfold. The police department released its findings from the internal investigation, confirming instances of misconduct on Hayes' part. In addition to his suspension, Hayes was ordered to undergo mandatory sensitivity training and face disciplinary hearings that could result in further consequences. While many celebrated this outcome, others argued it wasn't enough. Protesters took to the streets demanding broader reforms to address systemic racism and inequality within law enforcement agencies nationwide. Marcus watched these developments closely, torn between satisfaction and frustration. On one hand, He was glad to see momentum building around the cause he cared so deeply about. On the other hand, he knew real change wouldn't happen overnight. Laws could be rewritten, policies updated, and training programs implemented. But shifting mindsets required patience, persistence, and collective effort. Despite the challenges ahead, Marcus remained hopeful. He drew strength from the countless messages of gratitude he received from strangers who saw themselves in his story. A young woman wrote to tell him she no longer felt alone after hearing him speak about her struggles with racial profiling. An elderly man thanked him for giving voice to frustrations he'd carried silently for decades. Each note reminded Marcus why he had chosen to fight, not just for himself but for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In quieter moments, Marcus reflected on the irony of it all. His badge, a symbol of authority and service, had become both the source of prejudice and the tool of redemption. Without revealing it in court, the outcome might have been very different. That realization weighed heavily on him, underscoring the importance of visibility and representation. If his presence in the courtroom had challenged stereotypes and opened eyes, imagine what others could achieve simply by stepping into spaces where they weren't expected. Determined to keep pushing boundaries, Marcus expanded his work beyond advocacy. He partnered with educators to develop programs aimed at teaching students about civic responsibility and the value of diversity. He mentored young people interested in careers in law enforcement, encouraging them to lead with integrity and compassion. And he never stopped reminding himself, and those around him, that true leadership meant standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Though life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, Marcus carried the lessons of that day with him always. Every time he put on his Secret Service uniform, he remembered the weight of the badge and the responsibility it carried. Every time he drove past the spot where he'd been pulled over, he thought about the courage it took to challenge injustice. And every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not just a man who had overcome adversity, but a beacon of hope for those still fighting their own battles. For Marcus, the courtroom drama had been more than a personal victory. It had been a catalyst for transformation. By refusing to back down, he had inspired others to do the same. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Marcus Thompson would continue to stand tall, leading by example and proving that even in moments of darkness, light could break through. Months after the trial, Marcus Thompson's life had settled into a new rhythm, but the impact of that day in court lingered like an echo. The story of the Secret Service agent who stood up to bias and exposed systemic flaws became a symbol of resilience and dignity. It wasn't just about vindication, it was about transformation, both for Marcus personally and for the broader conversation around justice and equality. Marcus returned to his duties with the U.S. Secret Service, resuming the high-stakes work that had defined much of his career. Yet something had shifted within him. He carried a renewed sense of purpose, one that extended beyond protecting world leaders or dismantling criminal networks. Now he saw himself as part of a larger mission, a fight for fairness, transparency, and accountability in every corner of society. His badge no longer felt like just a tool of authority. It was a reminder of the responsibility he bore to lead by example. At work, Marcus became known as someone who didn't shy away from difficult conversations. During team meetings, he often shared insights gleaned from his courtroom experience, urging colleagues to consider how their actions might be perceived by the public. "We wear these badges," he would say, holding up his own, "but they don't give us permission to act without empathy. They remind us that we serve, not judge." His words resonated deeply with many of his peers, some of whom began reaching out privately to thank him for opening their eyes to perspectives they hadn't considered before. Outside of his official duties, Marcus dedicated more time to advocacy work. He joined forces with organizations focused on reforming law enforcement practices, helping them craft policies aimed at reducing racial profiling and improving community relations. He also traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, schools, and community centers. His speeches were never accusatory or divisive. Instead, they emphasized collaboration and understanding, urging people from all walks of life to come together to address shared challenges. One particularly memorable event took place at a high school in a predominantly black neighborhood. As Marcus stepped onto the stage, he was greeted by thunderous applause from students eager to hear his story. For nearly an hour, he spoke candidly about the traffic stop, the courtroom drama, and the lessons he had learned along the way. But what truly captivated the audience was his message of hope and empowerment. "You may face moments when people underestimate you or treat you unfairly," Marcus told the students, his voice steady yet warm. "But remember this: your worth isn't determined by their opinions. You have the power to rise above negativity and prove them wrong, not through anger, but through action. Education is your greatest weapon. Hard work is your shield. And integrity? That's your foundation." The room erupted into cheers, with several students rushing to the front after the speech to shake his hand or snap selfies. One young man approached nervously, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled questions. "Mr. Thompson," he said hesitantly, "do you think things will ever really change?" Marcus smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Change starts small," he replied. "It begins with each of us deciding to do better, to listen more, to care deeper, to stand firmer. Will it happen overnight? No. But if enough of us commit to making a difference, then yes, I believe things can and will get better." Back home, Marcus found solace in spending time with his family, especially Angela, whose unwavering support had meant everything during the trial. They spent weekends cooking meals together, laughing over old memories and discussing ways to continue supporting causes close to their hearts. Angela often joked that Marcus had become a local celebrity, pointing out how strangers sometimes recognized him at grocery stores or coffee shops. While Marcus chuckled at her teasing, he couldn't deny the pride he felt knowing his efforts had touched so many lives. Despite the progress, there were still moments of frustration. Change, as Marcus had warned, came slowly. Some critics dismissed his advocacy as naive idealism, arguing that deep-rooted issues couldn't be solved by speeches or policy changes alone. Others accused him of being too soft on law enforcement, claiming he should demand harsher punishments for officers like Daniel Hayes. These criticisms weighed on Marcus, but he refused to let them deter him. Instead, he doubled down on his commitment to finding common ground. "I've seen firsthand how anger can breed division," Marcus once explained during a panel discussion. "And while anger has its place, it fuels passion and drives action, it can't sustain long-term solutions. What we need is dialogue. We need to sit down together, acknowledge our differences, and figure out how to move forward as a united front." His approach earned him both admiration and criticism. Supporters praised him for taking a balanced stance, while detractors accused him of compromising too easily. Yet Marcus remained steadfast, believing that true leadership required walking a fine line between conviction and compassion. As the months turned into years, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the world around him. More police departments began implementing training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Community policing initiatives gained traction, fostering trust between officers and residents. Even legislation targeting discriminatory practices started gaining momentum in state houses across the country. None of these changes could be attributed solely to Marcus's efforts, but he liked to think his voice had contributed, however small, to the collective push for progress. On a personal level, Marcus found peace in reflecting on his journey. He thought back to the day of the traffic stop, the fear, the frustration, the overwhelming desire to prove his innocence. Those emotions had shaped him, teaching him the value of perseverance and self-belief. He remembered standing in the courtroom, revealing his badge not out of arrogance but out of necessity, and he recalled the stunned silence that followed, knowing in that moment that he had sparked a chain reaction far greater than himself. Now, as he drove through the same streets where it all began, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. The road ahead was still long, fraught with obstacles and uncertainties, but he knew that every step forward mattered. Every conversation, every policy change, every act of kindness added up to something bigger than any one person. In the evenings, Marcus often sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. He thought about the countless individuals fighting similar battles, people who woke up each day determined to make a difference, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. To them, he offered a silent promise. Keep going. Keep believing. Together, we'll get there. And as the stars emerged one by one in the night sky, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he believed, truly believed, that brighter days lay ahead. After all, he had already witnessed the power of truth, courage, and integrity. And if those qualities could transform one man's life, imagine what they could do for the world.